Welcome to this virtual launch of Going for Broke, Lord Ashcroft's biography of Rishi Sunak. I'm Paul Goodman, the editor of Conservative Home, and I will be helping to guide us all through this evening's proceedings. Let me make a few housekeeping announcements at the start and explain what's going to happen. In a few moments, I'm going to hand over to Lord Ashcroft, who will speak about his book. Then there will be a short film. Then I'll have a conversation with Lord Ashcroft about Going for Broke. Then another film. Then finally, in the last 15 minutes or so of the event, questions, and we aim to wrap up at about 8 o'clock. By the way, there is a link, or should be shortly, in the chat section that will enable you to buy the book, to buy Going for Broke. And I'm very pleased to say we're joined this evening by the best part of some 800 participants. So, without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Lord Ashcroft, international businessman, philanthropist, former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, and not least, proprietor of Conservative Home. So, Michael Ashcroft, it's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and good evening, and thank you for logging on to this virtual book launch. Of course, we'd hoped to have a proper party, and I quite like the idea of inviting Rishi along as a waiter. He looked so at ease a couple of months ago, serving customers at Wagamama. But now, unfortunately, we have a rule of 6. I like to think that invitations to my book launches are a hot ticket, but a gathering of just me and 5 guests would have been a little too exclusive. So this is a COVID-compliant way of celebrating the publication of Going for Broke, serialized so brilliantly by the Mail on Sunday, and thank you to them for that. So here we are, not much more than 7 months after I first had the idea for this book, and now it's out. It's a testament to my publishers Bite Back and everyone else who has supported me in this project that I've been able to get it out so quickly. And researching the book in lockdown did present challenges. The upside was that many of the people I wanted to interview were stuck at home and much less busy than usual, and they were very generous with their time over Skype or Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc. And when I first conceived of this project, Rishi had been Chancellor for just a few weeks. It was early April, and the scale of the crisis this country was facing as a result of the pandemic was only just becoming apparent. And following the shock departure of Sajid Javid from the Treasury, Rishi had little over a month to prepare the budget, which would have been enough of a challenge in normal times. And these, as we know, were not normal times. Having pulled out all the stops to produce a budget that was almost universally well received, Sunak would have to return again and again to the Commons to announce ever more radical measures to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. In the space of a few weeks, he went from relative obscurity to household name. And the crisis has been testing for Sunak, both politically and personally. In his early career, he repeatedly spoke about enterprise, especially small companies and startups, but found himself part of a government whose response to coronavirus forcibly shut businesses down. Behind the scenes, he has been the leading voice for easing restrictions and reopening the economy, a view that now seems to have more support on the Conservative backbenches than in government. In one of his earlier speeches in Parliament, Sunak set out his credentials as a fiscal conservative, suggesting the government should spend no more than 37% of national income. He has since become the biggest spending chancellor in modern history. The pandemic response has cost well over £200 billion and counting, and our national debt now tops $2 trillion. The Sunak's battle to save jobs and businesses, especially the furlough scheme and Eat Out to Help Out, made him popular with many voters. But as he knows as well as anyone, it's easy enough to win friends when you're spending like there's no tomorrow. Sooner or later, these things will have to be paid for, and his budget in March could well start hitting people in the pocket. How he handles the Chancellor's traditional role of saying no to things will be another big test of his political skill. But as well as chronicle his handling of the early months of the coronavirus, I wanted to look beyond his work in the Treasury and look what came before. And just a year before, he became arguably the most important figure in government after the Prime Minister. He was virtually unknown outside Westminster. He was a hard-working but obscure junior local government minister, campaigning for rural broadband and better facilities for the disabled. And thus the speed of his ascent has been quite remarkable. It all happened so fast, there was no time for voters to get to know him, which is why I decided to write this book. And what do people already know about Rishi? They know that he's very hardworking, they can see that. But perhaps not that he works so hard in the Treasury that he sometimes has to be reminded to eat, unless it's one of those days when he's deliberately fasting, not for religious reasons, it turns out, but just to reset after the weekend. They know that he's incredibly bright, but perhaps not the extent to which he has excelled from his time at prep school, where he was head boy, through to becoming head boy at Winchester, achieving a first at Oxford, then becoming a Fulbright scholar at Stanford University in California. And some people know he married an Indian heiress, but they probably don't know much about his wife or his father-in-law, known as India's Bill Gates, a remarkable man who, despite being a billionaire, still lives in the same house he had before becoming super rich, and insisted at one time until he got older on, in fact, cleaning his own toilet. They probably don't know about his secret skills as a ballroom dancer, how he adapted from the glamour of his life as a banker in London, New York, and Los Angeles to life as a rural member of parliament on the village fete circuit in the Yorkshire Dales. Nor do people know the extraordinary tale of how his parents and grandparents came to England from India via East Africa. The heroine of that story is his remarkable late grandmother, who as a young bride in the 1960s sold her jewelry and crossed continents alone to seek out a better life for her future family. The story of their journey took quite some piecing together, and I think we may even have uncovered a few details that Rishi himself didn't know. And all this and more is in Going for Broke, which I hope enlightens readers about the background and character of a young man. He is only just 40, who is clearly going to be a key player on the political scene for some time to come. And incidentally, one of the other challenges associated with writing this book was how hard it was to find anyone with anything bad to say about Rishi. It was not that I actively sought criticism, more that I did not want this book to be a hagiography. And those of you who read Call Me Dave, my biography of David Cameron, will know that I'm not exactly afraid to reveal the good, the bad, and the ugly. And perhaps the single most remarkable feature of Sunak's rise is how few enemies he has made along the way, a most unusual achievement in the world of politics. Nobody seems to have a bad word to say about the guy. And I don't think this is just because so many believe he will make it all the way to the top in politics and they are anxious to stay on the right side. So I'm sorry to say that I don't think the book contains any lurid revelations of the Call Me Dave variety. Nonetheless, the rise of Rishi Sunak is quite phenomenal. And of course, it has not come to a stop. And I chose the subtitle of the book with some care, for he is only partway through his political career. And depending how things go, there may well be scope for a second installment, and who knows how the story will end. And in fact, Going for Broke has, with the passing of time since April, become a more pertinent title with what is going on at the moment. And what I can say, it's been a pleasure finding out where it all began. And Going for Broke is published today by Biteback and is available to purchase from their website and Amazon. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and back to you.
Thank you, Lord Ashcroft. We will now have a brief film, and after that, I'll return and have a Q&A with Lord Ashcroft.
Rishi Sunak, ex-banker, richest MP in the House of Commons, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He has the highest satisfaction rating of any British Chancellor since 1978. But how did he get here? Sunak was born on the 12th of May 1980 to Hindu parents in Southampton. He attended Winchester College boarding school and went on to Oxford University to study philosophy, politics and economics. He later attained an MBA from Stanford University. He started out as an analyst for Goldman Sachs, and in 2009 became a director of investment firm Catamaran Ventures. Catamaran Ventures is owned by Indian billionaire businessman N.R. Narayana Murthy, who is also Rishi's father-in-law. Sunak first stood as a Member of Parliament in the 2015 general election, contesting the seat for Richmond, taking over the constituency from William Hague. He served as Parliamentary Undersecretary for Local Government from January 2018 to July 2019, when he was then appointed as Chief Secretary to the Treasury by Boris Johnson. Sunak was eyed by Dominic Cummings as a rising star and loyal to Johnson, resulting in his promotion to Chancellor of the Exchequer on the 13th of February 2020. Little did he know what lay in store for him just a few weeks down the line. Read Lord Ashcroft's new book, Going for Broke, The Rise of Rishi Sunak.
Now, let's begin our conversation about the book. And I want to do so in this way. You write near the end of the book that the trouble with writing about a politician who's still in office, you say, is that the book must end before the story does. And that judgment's just been reinforced by what you said in your words of introduction. Now, since this is undoubtedly true, is it too soon to reach a meaningful judgment about a politician who, after all, has only been in Parliament for roughly 5 years?
Well, Paul, he's crammed a lot in those 5 years, and I think the answer is in the title. This book is about the rise of Rishi Sunak. And of course, you're right that it's too early for a definitive judgment on a whole career. But I think the story of his ascent from entering Parliament to becoming Chancellor in the space of 5 years is remarkable. It's worth remembering that until this spring, hardly anyone outside Westminster and Yorkshire had heard of Rishi Sunak. And suddenly he was one of the most powerful figures in a government dealing with a national crisis. And I thought it was worth looking into his background and these still early years of his political career. But I'm sure there's more to come. And will that be the Sunak supremacy, the Sunak legacy, or perhaps the decline and fall of Sunak?
And just to put all the cards on the table at the start, I think many of the people joining us this evening will want to know, how well do you know him and what cooperation did you have with him, if any, in writing this book?
I mean, frankly, I've met him in passing, but I haven't really spent time with him. In some ways, that's an advantage when writing a book like this. We have no history. So I was able to approach the subject without any preconceptions. And as for cooperation, it's not an authorized biography. He didn't actively cooperate apart from anything else because he had other things to occupy him. But he was not obstructive either. He and his team knew about the project from the start and did not discourage colleagues from talking to me, unlike the position that Cameron took.
And as you've just said, really, you came to this book with a bit of a blank canvas as far as Rishi Sunak was concerned. You don't really know him, and you've operated at a bit of a distance. But you will have reached a conclusion about him by the end. And in the course of your time knocking around in politics, you'll have drawn many judgments about many different politicians and what drives them. So, having studied Sunak, what do you think his values are, as politicians like to say now, and what drives him? What does he want to do in politics?
I think it sounds trite, but I think hard work and family are definitely two of them. It was his parents' hard work that gave him his start in life, and his own efforts that brought his own success. And I think there's also a real sense of service. People are cynical about this in politicians, but think what a huge pay cut he took by going into politics. He's talked about the contribution his parents have made to their local community and how that has inspired him. I think it's also given him a sense of responsibility to use his talents to do something worthwhile in life. And politically, I think he wants as many people as possible to have the opportunities that he had. He also talks about the dignity of work and the importance of enterprise, in the sense that he has a keen understanding that prosperity doesn't appear out of nowhere. And that's one reason I think he has been an advocate for not locking down any harder or for any longer than was in fact necessary. Free trade has also been an important driver for him, especially when it came to Brexit. But I think he's also a pragmatist. During the Brexit wars, there were plenty of principal resignations by junior ministers whose names we have all now forgotten. He understands that decisions are made by the people in the room.
And you've just referred to two aspects of him that come over very clearly early in the book, which are family bonds and a work ethic. But of course, they don't come in a vacuum. They come as part of his experience as a son of recent migrants, close-knit migrant family, Indian origin, but not having come directly to the country from India. And he practices a minority religion, Hinduism. So the inevitable question follows, as well as his belief in family and work, what do you think his experience as someone whose family arrived in this country fairly recently, and as the practitioner of a minority religion, what impact do they make on him?
Oh, wow, Paul. I get the impression that they're quite central to who he is, personally and politically. And one lesson from his family's experience in the last 2 or 3 generations will have been what you can achieve with hard work and determination. Probably that there are no limits to what you can achieve. Also, that there need not be any barriers for immigrant families having a happy, successful life in Britain. He's talked about how his family would carry on their cultural traditions while being absolutely part of their local community in England. And at the weekend, he would go to the Hindu temple and to football matches at his beloved Southampton. There was never any contradiction between two ways of life. And we're speculating here slightly because there are very personal things. But I also get the feeling that having a close family has been a great source of security for him and has helped to give him the confidence to achieve what he has. And I think the same may be true of his Hindu faith. He doesn't talk about it much, but it is important to him. And people who work with him in the Treasury have told me that he doesn't fret about things. And obviously he wants to make the right decisions. But once he's decided about something, that's it. He doesn't agonize about it. And I wonder if that sense of security and resilience come from that combination of his family and his personal belief.
Of course, part of the purpose of the book is to introduce him to a wider audience. And as Chancellor of the Exchequer, you may be fairly well known, but voters haven't quite yet got a complete sense of who you are. Now, let's try to think about the way ahead for Rishi Sunak and what voters might think of him as Chancellor and maybe, who knows, in other great offices of state. And I remembered something that Theresa May had said, words that are remembered and words that are controversial. And she said, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And I think she was thinking of people who'd done well out of globalization as citizens of the world. Now, isn't Rishi Sunak, with his Oxford first in PPE and his MBA at Stanford as a scholar and his marriage into billions and his international connections, isn't he a bit of a citizen of nowhere? That being so, can he really make the ultimate connection with voters, popular now as he may be?
Well, you're certainly setting me off on a rocky path here, but if all you had to go on was his CV and his bank account, you might well come to that conclusion. But I think these things are more to do with values and attitudes than just where you've been and what you've done. And I get the impression he's actually much more rooted than a citizen of nowhere. His Indian heritage and his time in America have certainly given him a global perspective, which I think helped to shape his views on Brexit, for example. But as I've mentioned, he talks a lot about how his parents were an integral part of their local community in Southampton as pharmacist and a family doctor, and how that was an important example to him. And I think his being an MP in Yorkshire has also been important in this respect. From the day he was adopted as the candidate, he threw himself into local life, especially getting to know about things like farming. Even as part of a global elite, I think sloshing around in the mud in his wellies would help give you a sense of place quite quickly. So if you didn't realize it already, it would soon have become clear that things sometimes look quite different from rural Yorkshire than they do from London or Silicon Valley. And I think that being a Northern MP is also important to him. He's conscious of being close to the Tees Valley, and wanting to bring investment and opportunity to these places is a big part of his longer term agenda.
And were Boris Johnson to fall under the proverbial bus, whatever sort of bus it might be, pretty clearly today, who knows what would happen in the future, but today Sunak would probably be a front runner to succeed him. So just to follow up your last answer, you seem to think that he does have the capacity, don't you, to connect with the voters in those famous red wall seats who gave Boris Johnson his near landslide last year, provincial voters with usually a Labour family background in Northern and Midlands working class seats.
This is one of the things about Rishi that we've yet to see. There are a couple of things in his favour. One is that for many of these voters, he is the Chancellor who helps save their job or keep them solvent when they might otherwise have gone under, which is something that people have spontaneously said in my polling and focus groups. Another is that people rate him as one of the perhaps relatively few ministers who seem to know what they're doing, which counts for a lot. The other is that people find him to be very personable and likable. And while he might not have the same kind of magnetism that we saw from Boris on the campaign trail, he's also much less of a Marmite figure. There is a sort of quiet decency and competence there that people might well respond to after these tumultuous years. But we have yet to see how he would step into that role of leading a campaign and trying to inspire voters on that level. And of course, it depends who he's up against and where politics has got to by then. You might also ask whether a Remain backing lawyer from North London would have more appeal to these voters than a Yorkshire Brexiteer.
You're conveying the sense of someone who's thought about the sort of person he is and how he's running the Treasury a lot, obviously. So trying to think ahead. Obviously, he could be Prime Minister. There's not much point in having a to and fro about that. But what sort of a Prime Minister would he be? David Cameron was a coalition Prime Minister who was very much a kind of establishment professional. Theresa May's premiership went sadly awry, and Boris Johnson's sort of extraordinary mixture of charisma and disorganisation amidst huge challenges. What sort of Prime Minister would Rishi Sunak be?
Without commenting, Paul, on your caricature of the three previous leaders, you can never really know until you see people in action. And when it comes to his agenda as Prime Minister, that's not something he's ever had to set out. Indeed, it would soon set alarm bells ringing in Downing Street if he did. And that's one of the things that will become clearer as time goes on. But as for how he goes about the job, I think he'd be very methodical, and we'd see a lot of attention to detail. I also think he would be pragmatic, which is something we've seen from him as Chancellor. A fiscal conservative who was willing to spend on an enormous scale when the situation called for it. I also think he'd be able to build relationships and alliances with other leaders. The relationships that he's managed to build during the crisis with people like trade union leaders is a good example of that. But I also think he'd be decisive. As Chancellor, he's had to come to decisions quickly, and I think that's something that would continue. And for all his niceness, I also think he'd be quite steely and determined. Making a fortune in the hedge fund world, getting into Parliament at your first attempt, and being Chancellor 5 years later aren't things that happen by accident.
We're having at the moment rather a blue skies conversation about the possibility of him going further than his present post as Chancellor and perhaps becoming Prime Minister. But it is a law of politics that what comes up must at some point come down. And as he rather hinted, hasn't he come up in public opinion, not primarily because of his presentational skills or because of his mastery of a brief or because he works very hard, but because essentially so far he's been a bit of a Father Christmas, handing out loans, grants, subsidies, eat out to help out and all that. So what's going to happen to his standing if, or I rather fear it's when, he turns into Scrooge, cutting spending and raising taxes?
I mean, this is the big question. I mean, he knows as well as anyone that it's easy to be popular when you're spending like there's no tomorrow. The Chancellor is traditionally the one who has to say no to things. When that starts to happen, it will be telling how he deals with any hit to his reputation. We'll see if he has the political skill to cope with the competing demands of the Prime Minister, Tory MPs, the voters, and the public finances. But I think he's put himself in a good position. He managed to convey to people that he was on their side and was doing everything he could to help, which I don't think was just to do with the sheer amount of money that he was spending. People felt he had a degree of empathy, which was unusual for a political, and perhaps especially unusual for a Conservative. And the other point is that he comes across as extremely competent at a time when competence is at a premium. So if he plays his cards right, he could be seen as someone doing a good job of making tough decisions with the interests of the people at heart, though that will not be an easy trick to pull off, but let's see if he can.
The video at the start of this event reminded me, just in case I was in danger of forgetting, that he's been Chancellor for less than a year. And he came in turbulent circumstances when Sajid Javid resigned. And in the course of that year, because of the coronavirus, he's made, by my count, roughly 10 major financial statements, in some of which he's really been very rapidly adapting announcements he made before. So he's just brought back furlough. In October, he changed the terms of the replacement for furlough scheme that he brought in September. So there's been a lot of policy making on the hoof by the Chancellor. How effective do you think he's been during this crisis? We know about the glossy presentation and the mastery of detail and the hard work, but how well's he performed?
Well, here I go from the shallows into the deep end, Paul. I think the main measure of his effectiveness is that the economy hasn't collapsed. Without the furlough scheme and business loans and other measures, we could have seen thousands more firms going under and millions unemployed in a very short time. There'll be a lot more pain to come. But the fact that he was able to keep things on the rails as far as he has is a major achievement. Of course, not everything was perfect. Some money will have been wasted, while some people didn't get the help they needed. And as you say, he needed to adjust things as he went along. But given the speed at which he had to work, it would have been amazing if there weren't mistakes, and things could clearly have been very much worse. And also, don't forget that when he was appointed, a lot of people were saying he was just Boris Johnson's poodle. I think it was called Chino, wasn't it? Chancellor in name only. But no one is saying that now. He's clearly become a powerful voice within the government's inner core, which is another measure of his effectiveness as a politician and as an operator.
When you look around at the competition, as it were, if Boris Johnson did fall under this proverbial bus, I mean, all in all, what do you think his chances of being Prime Minister are? I suppose really, inevitably, that's a question about the short term, because in the long term, we can't really know.
A wise person, Paul, once said it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And it depends on so many things. How long Boris goes on and on, what happens with the pandemic, who wins the next election, how the economy fares, and how far Rishi gets the credit or the blame. But from where we are now, you would have to say that his chances are good. Senior politicians who are competent and popular are not exactly to a penny. Now, part of it will obviously depend on who he's up against in any leadership contest and the vision he can set out for the Conservative Party. One of the questions that people ask in the book is what it is, in political terms, that runs through Rishi like a stick of rock. It's fine to say you're unencumbered by dogma during a national crisis, but in a tough leadership fight that could be made to look like a lack of principle or direction.
What's his biggest strength, do you think, having researched and written the book? And what do you think his biggest weaknesses? One thing that struck me that came out of the book and you picked up was he's not exactly a loner. He's a very sociable chap, but he doesn't seem to me to have a kind of gang in the way that some former Conservative leaders like David Cameron did, and in the way that Boris Johnson eventually acquired one. So, biggest strength and biggest weakness, would you say?
Well, let me cheat a bit. I think his biggest strength is a combination of huge intellect, ferocious work ethic, good political judgment, the ability to project himself well, and a great interpersonal skills that enable him to win people over. That, and a quiet confidence in who he is and what he can do. Now, weaknesses are harder to pin down, but one is still probably inexperience. Now, it seems an odd thing to say about one of the most senior people in government, but having only been an MP for 5 years, he is still learning, which I think he's also aware of, a positive sign. There are things in politics he hasn't yet had to do, like deal with unpopularity or intense personal criticism. That will come. Interestingly, his former boss at Goldman Sachs worried that Rishi was too nice for politics. So we'll see whether he has that extra edge of ruthlessness that is sometimes needed to make it all the way. But as I say, you don't come as far as he has without a certain amount of ambition and determination.
And penultimately, it's impossible to imagine from the story that this book tells, and I could, having read it, sort of pick this up as I got probably even a third of the way through it. One just knew as a reader that you weren't going to find exciting claims about Sunak, for example, inserting his private parts into a dead pig's head, as was the case in one of your previous biographies. There are no apparent indiscretions. There's one claim of debatable impropriety, which I might come back to that in a moment. And there are frequent accounts from everyone of how nice he is. So from that point of view, given that an author is always looking for a dramatic story to tell, was this a disappointing book to write?
Well, Paul, that would imply that I had set out looking for a scandal. I wasn't aiming to dig dirt. There's a lot we didn't know about Rishi before, such as the story of how his family came to Britain, the impressions of people who have worked closely with him, the fact that he was once rather a good ballroom dancer, things like that. I wanted to find out more about what explained the rise of Rishi Sunak, and I think that's what the book does.
I'm just going to follow up the impropriety point, because it's reported in the book that he didn't declare his wife's use of the furlough scheme, and it's arguable, I suppose, that he should have done. And I see from reading the book that he took advice from the civil servants he should have taken advice from, and decided not to declare it. I mean, if that's really the worst charge that an opponent who wanted to look through your book for material to attack him, that's the worst charge they could find, he's sort of pretty good standing, isn't he?
That sums it up, Paul. That sums it up. It's a fascinating read from where Rishi's roots came from, where he is today, and for us to speculate as to where it could go.
Finally, of course, well, you're doing a biography year, I think. You've done Jacob Rees-Mogg. Rishi Sunak is now dispatched. We have Going for Broke. You may return to update it in due course, but who's your next subject going to be?
I'm very happy to listen to suggestions from anyone. I have a few names in mind. There will be another one. It's just a matter of which one it is. But I am doing some other books at the moment, so this might be something for later next year. But there will be someone.
It wouldn't necessarily have to be a Conservative politician, would it?
Nope. It could be fun doing somebody else.
There's a prominent Labour one around at the moment. I don't think a biography has been written of him. Sir Keir. But let's leave it there. I think we're in rough time for the second film now. And after that, we will go over to the Q&A from the people who've joined us this evening.
Boris Johnson has today announced his new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
And who is this Rishi Sunak? I've never heard of him. I don't even know who he is.
With the number of daily cases of coronavirus rising,
COVID-19 coronavirus,
a short national lockdown.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Now, in some senses, this was a bit like a mini budget from Rishi Sunak, but no red book and no costings on precisely how much this is going to set back taxpayers.
I'll tell you what, I for one am very thankful for Rishi Sunak.
To all those at home right now, anxious about the days ahead, I say this: you will not face this alone.
Our message today is simple. We stood behind Britain's workers and businesses as we came into this crisis, and we will stand behind them as we come through the other side.
Today, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced a new job retention scheme to help workers.
I know people
through the
are
winter
anxious
months.
and afraid right now, but I want them to know that we have a plan to protect jobs and support businesses. And what was true at the beginning of this crisis remains true. It's on all of us to get through this together.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
Rishi Sunak.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
Rishi Sunak.
Chancellor Rishi Sunak.
So, I want to know your thoughts. Have you heard of Rishi Sunak? Who is the man in charge of the money?
Without any more ado, Lord Ashcroft, let's go to the questions that we've had from people writing in. Here's the first. It's from someone called Andrew Pierce, who has an email address at the Daily Mail. I think you may know this gentleman. Anyway, he asks...
Well, regrettably so.
Tories had the first Jewish leader in Disraeli, first woman leader in Mrs. Thatcher. Will they be the first British political party to elect a Hindu as their leader, asks Andrew Pierce.
Well, yes, and there's certainly a good chance of that. And if it came to a leadership contest, I don't think the candidate's ethnicity will be foremost in people's minds. But as someone in the book observes, the Conservative Party would probably take some satisfaction in electing the first party leader from an ethnic minority, just as it had the first Chancellor from a nation background, closely followed by the second, and the same with Home Secretaries.
The next question is from Amit Roy, who asks, does Sunak's future depend too much on the patronage of Johnson? After all, he's not been around long enough to have an independent political base.
What the question is, are you saying is that when Rishi backed Boris, did he have a cynical motive for his own career? I would answer that by saying, with a question mark, a politician having cynical motives? I mean, what a terrible accusation. I think he backed Boris for two main reasons. One was that he felt that the Brexit process needed to be led by a Brexiteer, as a lot of people had concluded after the Theresa May era. The other was that he thought Boris would have the best chance of winning a general election with an overall majority. And as for his own career, he was obviously going to advance further if the Tories stayed in government. So on that logic, Boris was good for him too. But I'm not sure you could count that as a cynical motive.
And James Finn asks, because Sunak's a relatively recently elected senior government minister, has your approach to writing this new book been different to your other political biographies? I suppose Mr. Finn's thinking David Cameron had been in the House of Commons since 2001, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, your last subject, came in, I think, in 2010. So they've both been around for longer than Chancellor.
Well, the main difference is that with a relatively new figure, there is much less in the public domain. So you actually have to dig a bit further. And anything you can find is more likely to be new, which is rewarding. But the basic approach is the same: to read everything about them that you can get your hands on and find people who have known him at different stages of his life and ask them to talk about him.
And talking of researching the book, this isn't just simply a UK story, it's also a story that has happened in part abroad, and of course, particularly in India. How much were you able to find out about the Chancellor's Indian connections, and indeed his wife's family's connections in India?
Well, I mean, you have to read the book on that. But on that subject, some of the most interesting stuff is in the very first chapter, namely how his family came to end up in England. It is an inspiring story, and that itself is worth a read.
And Ollie Cowley asks, what did Johnson see in Sunak to promote him so rapidly? After all, he may not have known Rishi Sunak very well. And at one point, Rishi Sunak was really quite an obscure minister. He was tucked away in the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, dealing with local government finance. Important subject, but not one that was at the forefront of political attention.
Well, certainly, Paul, it certainly didn't hurt that Rishi had backed Brexit and backed Boris for the leadership. And when he was first appointed as Chancellor, a lot of people assumed they were the only reasons that Rishi would be a poodle. But people inside the party and the government knew there was a lot more to him than that. As a local government minister and in the general election TV debates, he had shown that he was on top of his brief, well presented, and as they say in politics, a safe pair of hands, and importantly, loyal. He had impressed Sajid Javid, who says he suggested to Boris that he appoint Rishi as his successor as Chancellor.
Now, we've got a bit of time in which to take questions that have just come in. So we should be able to manage 3 or 4, I think, before the event wraps up at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to ask you a question from the look of it, I'd say this is someone you know called Michael Wade, because he says, "Hi, Michael. I guess the question is whether he, Sunak, is a future leader capable of attracting centre-ground voters," and here's an interesting point, and also Scottish voters not wanting independence. I seem to remember from seeing one poll that Boris Johnson doesn't poll well in Scotland, but Rishi Sunak at the moment is not polling badly. At any rate, Michael Wade asks, what's your assessment, Michael? Missing your parties too? 2 exclamation marks.
Yes, I think Michael was referring to the binge at the Pink Pussycat Club. I don't go there anymore, Michael. I think Rishi, because of his background, his family, his ability to communicate, I mean, the very fact that he was able to get nominated by the Yorkshire constituency of Richmond, which is hardly a metropolitan area and probably a constituency of fewer ethnic minorities, speaks volume for his ability to be able to get on with everybody once they have started to meet him. And I think he would, he's a great advocate of the union of the United Kingdom. And I think he would be excellent in attempting to keep that union together. And of course, there'll be people on the Scottish independence side that would not listen to anybody. But I don't think that would be a problem for Rishi. He's already shown how he can be collegiate, how he's gone about his rise without being unpopular.
The next question, well, it's really about something the book might have had to take into account if you were publishing next month, which is the current disturbances in number 10, with the departure of the Director of Communications, Lee Kane, and the question mark over the future of Dominic Cummings. I mean, this may not be a question we can really answer yet, but someone called Edward L. is asking, do you have a sense on how Sunak will navigate through these difficulties? Of course, it is a fact that the new press secretary has moved from the Treasury to Downing Street, Allegra Stratton.
Well, it would be rather ironical if Edward L. was actually Edward Lister, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, asking me for advice on the book launch of Rishi Sunak book, wouldn't it? I don't think Rishi has a good relationship with Cummings, but don't take that as anything more than Rishi is quite capable of having a good relationship to anybody or everybody that he works with or has to work with. So from Rishi's point of view, I don't think he'll be too perturbed, other than the usual political one, that any turbulence of within Number 10 has a political impact on the party as a whole and those in government. But I certainly, on this occasion, don't want to go into the merits of pros and cons of Dominic Cummings, whether he should resign or not, or Lee Kane, or anybody else at Number 10.
It's an interesting question here from someone called Nathan, which has just flicked down my screen, Nathan Watson, who asks, how would a Sunak PM be on immigration policies? I'm just going to follow that up with an observation, because I think I remember from the book, I didn't know this before, that Sunak had made a list of the pros and cons of Brexit, and immigration control was on his list as a benefit.
Well, I don't think that Rishi would take into account anything to do with his own ethnicity, but would be looking at it purely from a UK point of view as to whether immigration as a whole is positive, negative, should be restricted, should it be a point system. But there's nothing in his heritage that would make him a pro or con anything other than what was in the interests of the country. And I could see him he's also a pragmatist. Remember that even though he was a Brexiteer, while a junior minister, he didn't cause waves in Theresa May's deal and voted with and for the government. He wasn't a rebel. He realized that there was no mileage at that particular point of time. So on immigration, I don't think it's an issue for him for who he is. I believe him to be a great patriot for the United Kingdom.
There's a question from Simon Pearce, which is, was Mr. Sunak, very formal, a party activist before his selection for Richmond? And did CCHQ place him on a de facto A-list as he sought a parliamentary seat?
Well, clearly he would have had to go through the normal Conservative Party process. But when Sunak decided he wanted to enter politics, he had very little contact. And in fact, his best contact was Forsyth, the political editor of The Spectator, who was his best man at his wedding. And Forsyth took the time to introduce Rishi to a number of political figures. And when he started, and he made great friends with Oliver Dowden, and when he started the process of getting a seat, he failed once to a seat that was offered to Dowden, and Richmond was then his second seat. And one of the things that happened, he just wooed the farmers and the rural people of Richmond, Yorkshire. And Stephen Parkinson, now Lord Parkinson, who was one of Theresa May's chiefs of staff, travelled down with Rishi after that and made the comment to us that rather than thinking of Rishi as a competitor for that seat, he rather hoped he'd get it. So even in that short period of time, Rishi's interpersonal skills came to the fore. And that is what he's relied on, rather than going through the grind of Conservative Party research, joining a local constituency, doing the heavy work. He was able to finesse all of that fairly rapidly. And that is indicative of the ambition of Rishi.
Probably got time for no more than two more, maybe just one, if we're going to end promptly. question here from Neil Gaddock. It's quite a good one, actually. What do we know about Sunak's attitude to the NHS, given his mother's background, and it's then added, and the amount of money he's having to spend on it?
Well, Rishi's a pragmatic conservative in terms of the NHS. He believes that that health at the point of entry should be free. But like many conservatives, this thing about privatizing the NHS is an opposition mantra that is very then difficult to define exactly what that means. And I believe he would like to see a combination of greater efficiency and value for money, but not upsetting the treatment side of the National Health Service. But because the NHS has always been the centre of political battles, it's very difficult to break through. But he is certainly an ardent supporter of the principles of the NHS. Anyway, Paul, I'd like to thank you for hosting this. Please buy the book in case you're thinking that you're helping some wealthy guy. All royalties go to charity, as they have done on every book that I have written. So thank you
very much indeed for joining us this evening at the launch.